The orphan of the Kremlin Ivan Vasilievich was born in 1530 to a world of absolute power and imminent chaos. His father was the Grand Prince of Moscow, Vasily III. When Ivan was just 3 years old, his father died. His mother, Elena Glenskaya, took over as regent, a capable and intelligent woman who ruled with a firm hand. But Ivan's world was shattered a second time when he was 8 years old. His mother died suddenly, almost certainly poisoned by rival noble families. The young Ivan was now a helpless orphan, the Grand Prince in name only, a pawn in a vicious power struggle among the powerful aristocratic clans, the boyars. The Kremlin, his home, became a nest of vipers. He witnessed firsthand the contempt the boyars had for the throne and for his own person. He saw them plunder the treasury, ignore his orders, and fight their murderous intrigues in the very halls of the palace. One story recounts how a powerful boyar would put his dirty boots up on the bed of Ivan's late father, a daily display of disrespect. These years of humiliation, fear, and neglect forged Ivan's character. He grew up brilliant, well-read, and acutely intelligent, but also deeply suspicious, resentful, and prone to explosive fits of rage. He harbored a burning, lifelong hatred for the boyars, whom he saw as selfish traitors who had usurped the power. That was his by divine right. He learned that to survive and to rule, he would need to be cunning, ruthless, and absolutely merciless. The first Tsar in 1547. At the age of just 16, Ivan decided the time of the boyars' misrule was over. In a brilliantly orchestrated ceremony, he had himself crowned not as the Grand Prince of Moscow, but as the first Tsar of all Russia. The title Tsar, Caesar, was a direct and audacious claim. It linked him to the legacy of the Roman and Byzantine emperors, positioning him not just as a king, but as the supreme, divinely ordained autocrat of a new Russian empire, the leader of the Third Rome. The early years of his reign were a period of extraordinary reform and promise. Guided by a group of talented advisors known as the Chosen Council and his beloved first wife, Anastasia Romanovna, Ivan proved to be a capable and visionary ruler. He convened the Zemsky Sober, the first assembly of the land in Russian history, to give a voice to the lesser nobility and merchants. He commissioned a sweeping reform of the Russian legal code, the Sudebnik of 1550, which standardized laws and cracked down on corruption. He modernized the army, creating a new elite infantry corps, the Streltsy, armed with muskets, and restricted the power of the hereditary boyars in military command. His foreign policy was equally ambitious and successful. He looked east to the remnants of the Mongol Golden Horde. In 1552, in a brilliant campaign, he conquered the Khanate of Kazan, a victory of huge symbolic and strategic importance. It was the first time a Slavic state had decisively defeated a Mongol successor state. He celebrated by commissioning one of the most iconic buildings in the world, the fantastically colorful, onion-domed St. Basil's Cathedral in Moscow's Red Square. A few years later, he conquered the Khanate of Astrakhan, giving Russia control of the entire Volga River and opening up trade routes to the Caspian Sea and Persia. The young Tsar was a hero, a reformer, and a conqueror. It seemed a golden age for Russia had begun. The descent into darkness, the turning point, the moment when Ivan the Reformer began his transformation into Ivan the Terrible, came in 1560. His beloved wife, the gentle and moderating Anastasia, died after a long illness. Ivan was utterly devastated and consumed by grief. He had always been suspicious, but now his paranoia became boundless. He was convinced that the boyars, whom he believed had poisoned his mother, had now poisoned his wife to strike at him. His paranoia was amplified by military setbacks in the long and draining Livonian War, a conflict he had started to gain a foothold on the Baltic coast. A series of betrayals, real and imagined, further unhinged him. His closest friend and one of his best generals, Prince Andrei Kurbsky, defected to the enemy, the Lithuanians, and began sending even insulting letters denouncing his tyranny. For even this was the final proof that he was surrounded by traitors. The chosen council was dismissed and its members exiled or executed. The Tsar's mind, always volatile, began to fracture. He came to believe that to save the state, to save his own soul, and to fulfill his divine mission as Tsar, he would have to crush all opposition, real or potential, with a divine and terrible wrath. He decided to remake the entire structure of the Russian state, to divide the world into light and darkness, and to become the instrument of God's vengeance on earth. The Oprichnina, a state apart in the winter of 1564, Ivan did something unprecedented that struck terror and confusion into the heart of Moscow. He packed up his treasures and his personal library, and with his family and a retinue of followers, he abruptly left the capital without naming a successor. For weeks, a terrified nation had no ruler. Then, 2 letters arrived from the Tsar. The first, addressed to the high clergy, accused the boyars and the church of treason and corruption. The second, read aloud to the common people of Moscow, assured them that the Tsar's anger was not directed at them. It was a brilliant and terrifying piece of political theater. The populace, who still saw the Tsar as their divine protector against the corrupt nobles, panicked and begged him to return. Ivan agreed, but only on one absolute condition: that he be granted the right to create a new personal domain within Russia, a state within the state, where his authority would be absolute and unquestioned. This new domain was called the Oprichnina. Oprichnina was one of the strangest and most brutal institutions in Russian history. Ivan carved up the Russian state, taking about a third of the land, including the most prosperous regions and key districts of Moscow, for his personal Oprichnina. The rest of the country, the Zemshchina, was left to be administered by the old boyar-led government. To run his new domain, he created a personal corps of followers, the Oprichniki, a fanatical brotherhood of some 6,000 men who swore absolute personal loyalty to him. They dressed in black monastic-style robes and rode black horses, their saddles adorned with the chilling symbols of their purpose: a severed dog's head to sniff out treason, and a broom to sweep it away. The reign of terror. The Oprichnina became Ivan's instrument for a 7-year reign of terror. The Oprichniki were a law unto themselves, a state-sanctioned death squad. Their purpose was to systematically destroy the power of the great boyar clans, the old landed aristocracy that Ivan had hated since his childhood. They descended on the boyars' estates, seizing their lands, torturing their servants, and executing entire families on the flimsiest accusations of treason. Ivan's paranoia and cruelty reached new depths. He created a bizarre mock monastic order at his new Oprichnina capital, where he, as abbot, would lead his black-clad Oprichniki in drunken, debauched parodies of church services. By day, they would preside over horrific, prolonged public executions in Moscow. By night, they would engage in prayer and drunken orgies. The Tsar himself often took part in the torture of his victims. Viewing it as a sacred duty to purge the land of traitors, the terror reached its horrific climax in 1570 with the massacre of Novgorod. Convinced that the great and ancient city of Novgorod was plotting to defect to Lithuania, Ivan led his Oprichniki on a punitive expedition. For 5 weeks, the city was subjected to an orgy of unimaginable violence. Thousands of citizens, men, and children were systematically tortured and killed each day. They were burned, impaled, or tied to sleds and run into the freezing river. The city, one of the great commercial and cultural centers of Russia, was utterly devastated. The sun's blood, the Oprichnina terror, eventually burned itself out. In 1571, the Crimean Tatars, taking advantage of the chaos, stormed past the distracted Russian defenses and sacked and burned Moscow itself. The Oprichniki, so effective at terrorizing unarmed civilians, proved useless at defending the state. The disaster was a moment of shocking humiliation for Ivan. In a rage, he officially abolished the Oprichnina and disbanded his followers, though the terror and executions continued on a smaller scale. He had broken the power of the old boyars, but he had also ravaged his own country, leaving it economically shattered and psychologically scarred. The most infamous and tragic act of Ivan's reign, however, was a deeply personal one. In 1581, the aging Tsar, whose explosive rages were now legendary, got into a heated argument with his eldest son and heir, also named Ivan. The details are disputed, but the most common account is that Ivan confronted his son's pregnant wife for wearing immodest clothing and began to beat her, causing a miscarriage. When his son rushed to defend her, the Tsar, in a fit of uncontrollable fury, struck his son on the head with his heavy, iron-tipped staff. The blow was fatal. As his son collapsed, bleeding, Ivan's rage instantly turned to horrified grief. He cradled his dying son, kissed his face, and cried out for a doctor, but it was too late. The heir to the Russian throne was dead, killed by his own father's hand. The act, immortalized in a famous and haunting painting by Ilya Repin, was the ultimate tragedy of Ivan's life. He had not only killed his beloved son, he had left the future of his dynasty and of Russia in the hands of his younger pious but simple-minded and likely intellectually disabled son, Fyodor. The bell and the legacy Ivan the Terrible never recovered from the death of his son. He became increasingly obsessed with death and his own damnation, surrounding himself with sorcerers and soothsayers. He died in 1584 while preparing to play a game of chess. His death, like his life, was steeped in legend. Some claimed he was poisoned, while others said he simply collapsed. He left behind a Russia that was transformed, powerful, and deeply traumatized. He had shattered the Mongol successor states, massively expanded Russian territory to the east, and forged a centralized autocracy that would define the Russian state for centuries. But the cost was immense. His brutal wars and the terror of the Oprichnina had decimated the population and ruined the economy. He had systematically destroyed the old nobility, creating a new service nobility that was utterly dependent on the Tsar, a crucial step in the development of Russian absolutism. His personal legacy was even darker. His murder of his heir plunged Russia into a succession crisis after the death of his feeble son Fyodor. This crisis would lead to the Time of Troubles, a devastating period of civil war, famine, and foreign invasion that nearly destroyed the Russian state. The Tsar, who had done so much to build the empire, had in the end brought it to the very brink of annihilation, terrible or formidable. The name Ivan the Terrible is in some ways a mistranslation. The Russian epithet Grozny is closer in meaning to fearsome, formidable, or awe-inspiring, a name that instills dread and respect, much like a wrathful Old Testament god. To many Russians, both then and now, he remains a complex and controversial figure. He was the visionary who built the Russian Empire, a pious defender of the Orthodox faith, and a strong ruler who crushed the selfish traitors who sought to weaken the state. To others, he was a paranoid, bloodthirsty madman, a tyrant whose cruelty knew no bounds and whose actions set a dark precedent for state-sponsored terror that would echo through Russia's later history. In the end, he was both. He was Ivan the Great, the conqueror of Kazan and the lawgiver, and he was Ivan the Terrible, the butcher of Novgorod and the murderer of his own son. He was the first and perhaps the most complex of Russia's Tsars, a figure of brilliant achievement and monstrous cruelty, whose turbulent reign of blood and glory forever shaped the destiny of the nation he forged.